I have nominally thought I would throw to Tennant on the EV stuff and Ellison on the contract for different stuff, but I'm not wedded to that. If you'd want to flip it, that's cool. Just let me know.
That's fine by me.
It's fine, yep. I think because Tennant is more excited by constitutional chaos and I'm more likely to go, yeah, hey, it's going to be fine.
I eat constitutional chaos for breakfast, says hardened former public servant Alison Reeve.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined, as always, by my two co-hosts, the exceptional Alison Reeve. G'day, Alison.
Hello, Luke. I am coming to you from Ngunnawal country tonight.
And a man not shy about pulling on the Akubra and doing some bush lawyering, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
I don't own an Akubra, but yes, I am happy to rely on all the authority and skill and moral force that a never practiced, never used law degree completed 20 years ago can give me.
Oh, you've been more qualified to be a bush lawyer than I am.
I don't see why qualifications or lack thereof should stop any of us from opining on what the Constitution of this great nation, Australia, has to say on any topic.
I have a pair of Blundstones. Maybe that makes me better qualified.
Yeah, you've got me beat. You're a better Australian to boot.
I see what you did there.
So, on this week's show, we look at a paper which examines whether using contracts for difference to incentivise investment in new renewable capacity could have perverse implications for social equity. But first, a controversial charge levied by the Victorian government on electric vehicle owners has been struck down by the High Court of Australia. The so-called EV tax charged EV owners 2.8 cents for every kilometre they drove. But last week, the High Court of Australia axed the tax on the basis that the charge is an excise and that according to the Constitution, applying an excise is the sole purview of the federal government. EV advocates hailed this as a big win that removes a barrier to accelerating adoption of electric vehicles. But not everyone is thrilled, as the judgment opens up questions around the constitutionality of a raft of other state taxes. Tennant, as our resident bush lawyer, are these two scrappy EV owners 21st century Daryl Kerrigans or feckless fiscal wreckers?
Can't they be both? I think it may take us a little while to really know what the upshot of Vanderstock and Victoria 2023 High Court of Australia 30, that's the decision if you want to go and look it up, dear summer uppers. What the full import of this decision is going to take a little while to see, because we have a judgment from a majority of the majority, 3 justices clubbing together and another judge concurring. And then we have some very strong dissents. And as is sometimes the case, we might see that what seems at first blush like an incredibly broad decision that will rule out a lot of other things subsequently might get narrowed if a dozen further cases come up as threatening to unseat all kinds of long-standing practices of state governments. Even the majority of the majority might wind up saying, oh no, we didn't mean to be quite as broad as all that, and finding some basis on which to narrow the application. But, that said, definitely bush lawyering here now, it really does look like the reasoning of the court, of the plurality of the court here, could rule out a lot of stuff. Because what they've said is, as you summarised, Luke, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia says the Commonwealth is the only one that can do excise. They said taxes on goods are excises, and that taxes on goods includes taxes at any stage in the life of those goods. To quote them, they said, any tax on zero and low emissions vehicles or any other goods, whether imposed at the stage of their importation into Australia or production or manufacture in Australia, or at any subsequent stage in their distribution, sale, ownership, control, use, resale, reuse, or destruction in Australia, or export from Australia.
What about the afterlife, Tennant? What if these goods live on?
I reckon if you could get somebody to testify on the non-corporeal soul transference of an electric vehicle, the court would say, yep, taxes on that can only be imposed by uniform national legislation. So, butt out, state of Victoria, if you want to pursue electric vehicles beyond the grave, you'll have to ask the federal government to do it for you.
Yep.
And so the question is, well, what else? Because this seems pretty much to drive a stake through the heart of any state-based tax on the use of EVs, but also
slight objection here, Your Honour.
Proceed, Councillor.
Justice Jago, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, said that if it had been structured as a fee for service or a licence for an activity, it would be constitutional. So the upshot of that, and full disclosure, I am not a lawyer, but this could mean if it was like an extra charge on your registration, it would be legal. Or if we considered that roads are services, then you could be charged for your use of that service, and that would also be legal. So I reckon there's probably some fairly frantic searching and legal backflip gymnastics with double pike going on at the moment to see whether it's possible to contort the Victorian one and potentially the New South Wales and South Australian ones into something that looks like a fee for service or a licence for an activity.
I bet they'll try. The majority of the majority had some pretty sniffy words about states that try to structure things in a way that pretends to be something but is really a tax on goods. So I reckon we will absolutely need some more judgments on all this to fully illuminate how it goes. If we shift our view for a sec, though, from cars and the use of the roads, it might be that a bunch of other fees and charges and taxes that states have got are unseated by this. And a family of them that is very relevant to this podcast is things that state governments do that have an effect on the price of electricity, which might be explicitly or implicitly a tax on the good of electricity. And that could include, we're wildly speculating here. So, don't take this to the bank and certainly do not rely on this as legal advice. But we could see problems with the state white certificate schemes, with the contracts for difference that are recovered, that costs are recovered through charges on electricity users, and on the little known but much hated by those who are aware of it, transmission easement land tax in Victoria, which pretends to be a land tax, but it just so happens to be a special extra rate of tax on the land that transmission lines run over and is passed through to electricity users. It's about half of the charge that you pay for transmission in Victoria is now transmission easement land tax, because it's a tax on electricity pegged against the price of land, which is a bit weird. Anyway, if anybody wants to go off and challenge any of those things, we will all get our popcorn and watch what happens, but it might be a bit chaotic.
Oh, look, I mean, we all love constitutional chaos, right? I mean, remember Section 44, the one where there was suddenly a whole lot of MPs who suddenly couldn't be MPs anymore and had to resign, and that was all very exciting and everything. But
untrustworthy foreigners, a lot of them was what we discovered.
Oh, and having office for profit under the crown and all sorts of things.
New Zealanders, my God.
The thing is that there will be a lot of very big brains in state and federal governments right now going, how do we settle all this constitutional chaos down, right? The Constitution is meant to be boring. If you find yourself at a place where the Constitution is exciting, that is not a place that you want to be. My bet is that when this judgment dropped, there was an email that went out pretty quickly from all of the state treasuries to all of the other departments in the state government saying, please send us a list of everything that you charge for. And we are going to send it off to the government solicitor and get advice about whether it's legal and whether it can be restructured to make it legal if they feel that it's not consistent with the judgment itself. You know, so I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, there was some stuff around last week saying, well, this is the end of the road for road pricing, for congestion charging and so on. But I can't see that the states will give up necessarily on that, and I can't see that the Commonwealth will give up on it either, because the Commonwealth knows that excise is disappearing. Yep. That we need to have a much better...
Fuel excise.
Yeah, sorry, fuel excise. A much better way to pay for roads, because that is actually very broken at the moment. Heavy vehicle road user charges are quite broken as well. So, you know, I think it's one more thing to chuck in the pot with that.
I think that's right. I think it's going to result in a lot of busy work, a lot of back and forth. It's going to make a lot of lawyers a lot of money. But the actual substantive thing that we need to keep an eye on is the reality that a transforming economy means that long-standing tax bases will decline over time and others will rise. And it is best to be proactive rather than reactive to that. So whether the specific approach that Victoria took was the right one is in some ways less interesting than the lantern that this whole debate hangs on the big tax reform agenda we're going to have to manage over the next decade or two as industries rise and fall and technologies rise and fall. We're talking tax reform on a pretty grand scale. And if there's one thing we haven't been very good at the last couple of years, it's tax reform. So, yeah, just worth making sure transformative tax reform hasn't fallen off the list, the very long list of very hard things we have to do over the next few years.
Yeah. Well, if the feds found themselves with both the sole legal capacity to implement and the sudden operational or tax-based preservation need to be the ones pursuing at the same time comprehensive dynamic road user pricing and maybe a national white certificate scheme to take over all the state ones that were falling over.
Oh, how 2010 would that be?
Yeah, well, it'd be a lot of work. A lot.
For those listeners who don't know, I designed a national white certificate scheme in a previous job.
I was going to say, do you need a brown paper bag to bring into Alison?
Well, look, the thing that was hardest about it was that you had to figure out a way to make all the state schemes fit in with it. And if the state schemes aren't constitutional anymore, then I think that problem disappears and it's a lot easier.
Enter Alison Reeve to say, here's one I prepared earlier.
For any EEC members listening in, don't get too alarmed by Alison and Tennant's wild speculation on this front. I think we're a long way of the High Court striking down the country's white certificate schemes.
I love the smell of wild speculation in the morning.
All right. Shall we chat about a report?
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Contracts for Difference are a policy mechanism for unlocking private capital by increasing certainty around returns. They are regularly deployed by governments in Australia to incentivise renewable energy investment and work by topping up revenue if wholesale electricity prices fall below an agreed level. These top-up payments need to come from somewhere, and in New South Wales the plan is for them to be recovered through the distribution network charges paid by electricity consumers. But a new paper from Tim Nelson and Tracy Dodd asks whether these charges risk being regressive by placing a greater burden on low-income households. Alison, this is a very reasonable question to ask. What did you make of the answer?
So I'm not sure what I made of the answer, Luke. So, I mean, I think it's probably worth talking through how they went about answering this question. So they got some data from one of the energy retailers. They had a data set of people who had claimed hardship payments and a data set of people who had not. And they were using those hardship customers as the proxy for low-income energy users. They then assumed a hypothetical contract for difference charge, and they looked at how much hardship customers pay versus typical customers, and then how that varied by region, and then whether there was a variation whether those customers had solar or not. Now, what they found on the basis of that data was that the poorest people seemed to pay more, because for the subset of people they had who were claiming hardship payments, those people were using on average more energy than the people who were not. And so that's kind of where the idea that this might be regressive comes from. So, you know, I'm not quibbling with them reaching that conclusion on the basis of their data, but one thing I would say is that I'm not sure that that was maybe the best way to go about answering the question, because people who are claiming hardship payments are not necessarily representative of people on low incomes. And in fact, one of the authors of this paper actually published something a year or two ago that found that using more energy than average correlates with being someone who claims a hardship payment. And so it seems to me, and I'd be interested to know what you guys think, that they may have chosen a data set that was not representative of low-income customers.
Well, it is a big deal for this paper because the findings, part of the findings, really hinges, and the recommendations hinge on this association in the data set between higher energy use than average and being a hardship customer. And so you would want to have a lot of confidence that that was right. People fall into the hardship programs of electricity retailers potentially for a bunch of reasons, like a massive recent change in life circumstances, the passing of a partner, the losing of their job, a major illness. There's lots of things that might happen that take you from a situation where you might have been paying your bills regularly and then suddenly you're unable to pay your bills on time. And yes, you can imagine those circumstances pushing somebody who was already on a low income into these hardship situations more frequently than somebody who had more financial resources to draw on. But it's not just a one-for-one association, I think.
And there is other data, for example, from the ABS and also from some work that Hugh Sadler did at one point as well, that showed that on average, people who are on lower incomes tend to use less energy, not more, which means that if you've got a volumetric based charge, which is what we're talking about here, those people the low income people would not be worse off than the high income people. The high income people would pay more on that basis. So the authors of this paper do note at the end that some much more detailed modelling would help answer this question better. And I think also some much better data would help answer this question better as well.
Yeah. And you could also imagine this situation changing. So suppose it was the case today that low-income people used more electricity than average households. And it could also be the case that very high-income people used more than average too, but then you'd have this weird dip in the middle of the income distribution in terms of energy use. We could also imagine, though, that as electrification of transport and homes proceeds, that it happens faster for those who are in a position to buy electric vehicles and to pay for home upgrades to electrify. And so it could easily be the case in 5 or 10 years' time that low-income households, even if they were to use more electricity than average today, use less than average tomorrow. And so that makes the recommendations potentially not very robust. But we should go into what the recommendations are.
Yeah, I think at the outset it's worth, I guess, clarifying what this paper is. So contracts for difference, an assessment of social equity considerations in the renewable energy transition. But it's not actually really about contracts for difference. It's about
things that make electricity more expensive.
So it's about, we're going to have to pay for a bunch of stuff. One of the things that could generate, charges that need to be passed on to consumers are contracts for difference, but there could be all kinds of things that as we move through this transition we need to pay for. And really what the paper is trying to work out is the relative impacts on social equity of applying that charge on a kilowatt hour basis.
Yep.
So for every unit of energy, you pay a little bit of money, or on a fixed basis as a fixed sum that's applied to everybody, and which one is likely to be more aggressive or less regressive. And then they move through some fairly logical steps to try and work that out. But as you say, depending on the quality of the data on which you're feeding into your model, the veracity of your conclusions off the back of that modelling is going to vary wildly. And I think as you say, the authors acknowledge this is an initial attempt to kind of answer this question. I think it's a good question to try and get one's head around, because one can expect there's going to be a whole bunch of this stuff happening. There's been a lot happening over the last decade. There's likely to be even more happening over the next. Thinking about how those charges are applied and doing it in a way which isn't regressive is something we should all care about, right?
Oh, you should always ask that question, no matter what policy instrument you've got, is what is the... And we talked about a bit about this in the last episode about costs and benefits, right? It's not enough just to look at costs and benefits in the broad. You also have to look at the distributional impacts.
So there's this question about who uses more electricity, poor households or other households. And if poor households use more electricity, then with the focus on the potential cost being distributed of the CFDs, then it is less inequitable to recover the costs of the CFDs through a surcharge on the fixed connection component than it is to recover it through the volumetric charge for how much electricity a household uses. And if they don't use more, if low-income households don't use more than average, then it isn't less inequitable to switch from the volumetric charge to the fixed charge. But there's a bigger question here that isn't really answered. It's not even asked, which is the CFD system in New South Wales actually going to push up the net cost of using electricity? Yeah. And it's a pretty important question.
This goes to, the difference between electricity prices and electricity costs, right? The thing that you get sticker shock on as a consumer is the whole bill, not just one component of the bill.
Yes.
And if the contracts for difference work in New South Wales, then what should happen is that overall the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity on the generation side should go down.
That's what Matt Keane promised us all.
Matt Keane promised us all that would happen, and that would outweigh the extra cost, you would hope, of what came through to you via the network charges.
Yep.
I still think, though, that that question about whether you're doing this in a volumetric way, so on a per kilowatt hour charge, or whether you're doing it as a fixed charge, matters in that world as well, because the thing about cheaper electricity is if you're not using as much electricity, then you don't gain as much from electricity being cheap. So, if the data that these guys base this on is right, and that poorer people tend to use more electricity, they will get more benefit from electricity prices falling than rich people will. But if it is not the case that happens, then they will actually get less benefit.
Yeah, and that would be a fascinating process to work through. This paper doesn't grapple with what the impact of CFDs will be on wholesale electricity prices at all, and it sort of takes me back to the conversation, as you rightly say, Alison, we were having last episode about cost-benefit analysis, and where you draw the boundary for these sorts of exercises really, really matters.
Exactly.
And the authors have drawn the boundary really narrowly. They've counted the costs that contracts for difference imposing on consumers in this case, but not the potential benefits in terms of driving down wholesale electricity prices. Now, I recognise that that is a much more complex exercise and unlikely beyond the scope of this short paper, which I think is like 6 or 7 pages, right? And again, the authors acknowledge that, you know, more work is needed, more complex modelling is needed, but that specific point around the interaction with wholesale electricity prices, I don't think is acknowledged on the way through, and I think that would have been a good thing to put a big flashing red light on, even if it was outside the scope of what they were able to do with this paper.
Yeah, and I think this is a great opportunity to talk about both what's actually going to happen in the New South Wales electricity sub-region and the wider NEM as policies like this roll out, but also to talk about how we talk about that, because there's going to be a lot of debate. As soon as people start getting bills with a line item on them that's disclosing something in relation to the costs of LTESs, long-term energy services agreements, as the New South Wales flavour of CFDs, there's going to be some commentary. And there's been a long process, actually, of the New South Wales government and its consumer trustee consulting with consumers about how, in what form they want to be told about this, because, you know, it's very easy to bake in a bad news story that is going to highlight the costs and not the benefits. So it's important to look at this. There are at least 2 interactions with wholesale prices that are important to think about with these CFDs. So one is the sell from the former New South Wales government, and really from everybody who's trying to use contracts for difference as a policy tool. The sell is that because the contract lowers the risks facing project developers to more or less just risks that they themselves ought to be able to control, like can they deliver their projects competently and on time and within budget and operate them well afterwards, they're guaranteed that if whatever the wholesale price turns out to be, they will achieve at least what the strike price in the contract is. So they should be able to get cheaper finance because they're a lower risk bet. And if, of course, the cost of renewables is the cost of building and financing them, if that component is cheaper, then the whole stream of energy from that project forever is cheaper, and the costs of the emerging New South Wales electricity system ought to be cheaper. So, okay, that's a claim. We could evaluate that, and it's an important thing to evaluate. But the other thing is that the nature of these contracts is they only get paid out on if the price realised by the project in the wholesale market is below the strike price.
Yeah.
And so if they're being paid out on, it means that prices were too low, which will also be having an impact on the costs that consumers face. Now, you could have a very unfortunate series of events where the prices only happen to be super low when these projects are generating because they're all generating at once maybe, and you have very high prices at other times when they're not available, and average prices are mediocre or high, but these projects are still getting paid out. But generally you'd think more payouts means lower wholesale prices means, it's not so bad for a consumer.
Yeah, I think yes and no. So what happened with the ACT contracts for difference was that...
The path breakers in Australia.
Indeed. The first set of contracts for difference to underwrite new renewable generation and deliver on the 100% renewable commitment for the ACT. So in that case, the contract is between the ACT government and the generator, but then the cost of that contract gets passed through to energy consumers. And what happened with that was that renewable prices and wholesale prices fell much faster than either party had forecast. And so the ACT government was locked into paying well above the wholesale price for electricity that was being sold to ACT consumers. And that cost was being passed through to ACT consumers. And so ACT prices were actually quite high compared to the rest of the country. The thing that saved the ACT government was the war between Russia and Ukraine, because all of a sudden then the wholesale price really shot up and it was up to the renewable generators to pay the ACT government for the difference on the upside. And again, that got passed through to ACT consumers, and ACT electricity prices were the only ones that went down last year and down this year. So a lot of these things with these contracts really rides on being able to pick the right price in the first place, and also I think to have. And I mean, I think you sort of see this when you look at the federal one, the federal government ones with the capacity investment scheme, is also the ability to kind of put a cap and a collar on it so that it's not infinite downside and infinite upside. And again, the extent that that's flowing through to consumers, that also shields consumers from some of that price impact either way as well.
And remembering that, the impact on consumers in terms of prices, upside or downside, is an absolutely crucial lens we need to bring to this. But there is another, important sort of policy outcome which governments are trying to achieve, which is ensuring the flow of private capital continues to hit the market in a timely way so we can do what we need to do, which is effectively rebuild our entire electricity system in the space of about 15 or 20 years. And the uncertainty around, the shape of our electricity market, how markets are going to operate, what returns can be expected as we move through the next 5, 10, 15 years, is something which can cool investor enthusiasm for leaping into this market. And contracts for difference are one way of giving them a degree of certainty around that. And so there is no doubt that there's a little bit of a premium, right, for ensuring that investment flows. But the judgment of government is that it will be way worse for a whole bunch of reasons if they weren't providing a degree of certainty for those investors and that infrastructure wasn't being built. And so you can do the maths, the cost-benefit analysis around a particular project or a particular set of projects associated with a particular CFT program. But there's also, you've got to think about the galaxy brain of what we're trying to achieve with all this, which is this major effort to, completely transform the infrastructure associated with our electricity system over what is a very short amount of time.
Unless you've got a high degree of confidence that the underlying design of the wholesale electricity market, the energy-only market in the national electricity market, would be on its own, if everybody would back off and let it, enough to deliver all the investment, motivate all the investment that we need. And I don't know how many people do have that confidence these days, or believe that it would work if people let it, but don't believe that people will step back and let it. Then you've got to supply some policy mechanism, market mechanism that's going to underpin that investment. It's going to have a cost, and the cost has got to be paid. There is still, even if all of that is true, an argument about, well, okay, but should the costs of the system, by whatever means, through wholesale prices or surcharges for CFDs or line items for RETs or whatever, should those costs be visited on the poorest people to the same degree as other energy users?
Well, there was one thing that was missing from this discussion, and is actually often missing from a lot of discussions around price, which is all of the energy consumers who are not in the residential sector. And how much are they paying? A lot of those businesses have been shielded from the cost of the RET for a long time. either because they were an emissions-intensive trade-exposed industry or because retailers had the flexibility not to pass costs on to them. And they're now benefiting from the transition, and they will continue to benefit from the transition. So this is the other part of the fairness and impact question, which I don't think gets properly unpicked, and it's certainly not within the scope of this paper. Are we making sure that the full gamut of people are paying and that the people who will benefit are paying, and not just having all of it sheeted home to one sector of the economy?
There's another proposition that this paper puts, which is that, in their view, the preference is that consumers don't pay at all, that we rely on consolidated revenue, that taxpayers fund these sort of schemes. I'm not sure if they're saying that should always be the case for CFDs. I know that certainly the capacity investment scheme, I think, is partly funded or wholly funded.
It's entirely. It's the Commonwealth Treasury stands happily behind however many of these contracts are going to be let. We don't know how many. In the end, the budget numbers were not for publication in the last budget, but it's going to be a bit. There's 600 megawatts of capacity to be auctioned in the South Australian and Victorian round coming up.
Two things about that. First of all, I know I probably say this every episode, there is an opportunity cost if you do that. If something that the government pays out on CFDs is something that they can't spend on schools and hospitals and everything else, and those also have distributional impacts. So the impact of withdrawing services has a distributional effect as well. There is a bit of a zero-sum game here. But the second part of this is, in the long run, if you're talking about a very high renewables grid, you do have to figure out a way to underwrite new investment because, while what Luke says is right, is that we're rebuilding this system in a short period of time, but then it doesn't stop after that.
Yeah.
Because the wind farms will get old and they will need to be replaced, and the solar farms will need to be replaced. And the thing that is different about renewables versus any other market is if you're producing any other good or service, when the price goes up, you can choose to produce more. And when the price goes down, you choose to produce less. And you can't, if you are an individual renewable generator, you can't do that. You can't make the wind blow faster just because the price is higher. And so there's always a higher degree of uncertainty about the returns. And that's going to be there is residual uncertainty even when we've gone through this big period of transition, and we need to figure out a way to do that. And some form of underwriting, however we do that, seems to be where people are coalescing as a solution. You need some kind of underwriting of the demand side so that the investment will come in and take the risk on the capital.
You've also got the challenge that we have an energy market design where all the bids for what price generators are willing to generate at are stacked up from cheapest to most expensive by the market operator every 5 minutes, and they dispatch all the way up the cost curve just as far as they need to go, depending on where demand is at that moment. And then whatever that marginal bidder, the most expensive of those they need to call on, has bid, is the price that everybody gets paid. That is a design from an era when, and we're still in maybe the tail end of that era, maybe not, when all the generators had a fuel cost. And so they would never bid, or rarely bid, lower than what their short-run cost to actually operate and provide that electricity was. Wind and solar have no short-run marginal cost. It is pretty much just as expensive to not generate electricity from them as to generate once they're built. And if there's a market where the bulk of the megawatt hours are ultimately coming from wind and solar with zero short-run marginal costs, does that underlying market design still work? Or does it produce an environment where everybody might imagine that most of the time they're going to earn nothing on their output because they're all generating at once and they've all bid zero?
We're going into Ron Ben David territory here about what is the new NEM?
It goes to the point Tennant's made from time to time on the podcast about, the era of big government getting in and doing things, rolling up their sleeves and making sure stuff happens. It doesn't necessarily mean governments finding the money and building things themselves. It can be through mechanisms like contracts for difference, which give very clear signals to the market, opinionated signals to the market about what's needed, but then the market delivers and owns and operates that within the guardrails that government has provided. But I can imagine a scenario where, that gives us the breathing room to learn what the new steady state is. As you say, Alison, the new world where we have to replace this renewable capacity, but we understand what the characteristics of that market are and what incentive arrangements, whether it's we can find a way of doing that in an energy over only market, or if there's some form of underwriting that's required. That's another podcast to kind of unpick all of that. But one would hope that one could get to a world where perhaps governments can step back a little bit again, having sort of determined the characteristics of that new market. But it seems like we're a long way away from that, and there's a lot of learning to do between now and then.
I feel like there's a whole set of rapture-related metaphors that could be deployed here. We're in a period of government intervention tribulation, and the second coming of free market Jesus will eventually restore some kind of neoliberal heaven. I don't know. But anyway, difficult and offensive territory that I've just blundered into. Well done, me.
The market's not the Messiah. It's a very naughty boy.
So here's a question about one of the other recommendations in the paper, because the recommendations are quite interesting, and you might consider adopting the recommendations even if you feel like the case is unproven on some of the rest of the analysis. They toy with the idea of charges being recovered in a way that is income linked, and so have a progressive pricing for electricity in a different way to the sense of progressive pricing that currently exists. Does that seem like something that would ever be of interest, or would it be too complicated? Or would it risk exacerbating poverty traps?
I think it would be way too complicated, right? The energy bill relief payments that were announced last year and that were meant to be sort of coming, they were meant to arrive in February, and they ended up not arriving until much, much later. One of the reasons that they took so long was because you had to match the federal tax data with the state data about who's eligible for concessions, because that's different in different states, and then match that to actual retailer customer data to figure out who should be getting energy bill relief and how much they should be getting.
Yes.
If we had a fully state-owned system and it was all owned by one level of government, and that happened to be the same level of government that had the tax data, then I think absolutely you could do it. But I think when you've got so many players, I find it really hard to see how in practice you could do that. You may be able to do something a little blunter, like if you've got a concession card, you get one rate of CFD pass through, and if you don't have a concession card, you get the other rate, or something like that. It's also, it's got to be something that is easy for a call centre to check as well, which means it's very hard for it to be tax data, because tax data is quite private. We don't tend to go running around telling everyone how much tax we pay. So you may be able to do some little things like that, but I think fully targeting it on the basis of your income it would be incredibly complicated. The other thing is you also need to distinguish between income and wealth. There are a lot of extremely wealthy people who show very little income and pay very little tax as a result. Yep. You have people who have complex tax arrangements and that sort of stuff. So there would be big holes, I think, in a system if you tried to do that. I think the other thing is too, and again, I feel like I've been saying this a lot lately, a lot of these problems go away if you have a good progressive tax and transfer system that redistributes to the people who are most in need and doesn't have loopholes in it. You don't need to put extra fancy things into your electricity tariffs if your tax system is working properly.
But surely the excitement of a Rube Goldberg social welfare system where there's complex little equality bolt-ons to every single bit of policy that can support them.
Tenet, for every Rube Goldberg video that you see on YouTube, there are 99 where it didn't work, right? where the little marble fell off the table or failed to knock over the domino or whatever else. The thing is, the more complex your system is, it only takes one thing to be slightly wonky or out of whack for the whole thing to just go haywire.
I'll defer to your engineering expertise on this one, Alison. Do we have anything else to say about this report?
There was an interesting point in it, and which I did want to quibble with a bit. Was that one of the things that they looked at was which LGAs, which local government areas, would be disproportionately affected. And it seemed like one of the things that they wanted to hang on this paper was that if you do look at New South Wales, when you take the LGAs with the low average incomes are also the ones in the Hunter Valley. And those are potentially the consumers that are most affected by the closure of coal and the end of coal exports. And so it felt a bit like they wanted to hang this paper off a just transition hook as well. The thing is, if you go to Queensland, where you also have a very large amount of renewable and network generation, network build taking place as part of the transition, the coal mining LGAs are on average wealthier than most other ones in Queensland. So that is a very specific to New South Wales thing, and I think actually the paper would have been stronger if they hadn't tried to hang it off that just transition hook in that way.
The only other thing that I'll add is that to the irresponsible fears I stoked at the start of this episode about the impact of the High Court decision, the High Court logic would absolutely correlate, I think, the idea put forward in this paper that the cost recovery piece of the New South Wales LTESA system is a tax on the good of electricity, a regressive one, and that it is unconstitutional. I don't know if a court will actually find out that irresponsible speculation is correct, but it might, in which case, the New South Wales Treasury might wind up, or the Federal Treasury, being the sole backer of this scheme after all. Well,
or it's a fee for service, and putting my bush lawyer hat back on, if everyone is paying the same fee for using the service, then according to Justice Jago, then that's constitutional. And that would fit with it being a fixed charge rather than with it being a per kilowatt hour charge. I think. Sounds like it's right, doesn't it?
Usually we find more research is needed. This time, more lawyers are needed.
That's right.
Maybe some actual lawyers.
Legal scholars may also find this a rich seam of investigation going forward.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Alison, what have you got?
So it's government annual report season.
Hooray!
How exciting. I noticed glancing over the Clean Energy Finance Corporation's annual report the other day, I came across quite an interesting stat that they highlighted in there, that they're now getting a 5-to-1 leverage of private capital to CEFC investment. And that's a long way from their historic average, which was more around sort of a 2-to-1. So $2 of private capital going in for every dollar that the CEFC invested. And what I kind of hope this means is that the private sector is actually getting more comfortable with lending to and taking equity in the energy transition. Quite relevant to what we're talking about today as well, really. The other thing that was in there too was just having a go at estimating how much capital is needed for things like industrial sector transformation. And they're the sort of numbers that kind of, make you lose your breath and water your eyes. But the useful thing that they did was that they sort of said, well, sure, $625 billion if you want to do green steel and critical minerals, but that's actually pretty similar to what it cost us to establish the LNG industry. And it's about 10% of the export value of those things, and that's kind of what you'd expect to spend in order to establish them. And so, even though these numbers for this transition are really big and the time frame is very short, they are actually pretty comparable to what we've done before. And that's kind of a relief, actually.
Hooray. We have done big things. We can do big things. We can pull ourselves out of our current funk of worrying whether we're able to do anything at all.
Yeah, although I think there's probably quite a role for contracts for difference in underwriting some of that. So,
That's the approach they're taking in Germany.
Indeed.
Your government report season comment puts me in mind of climate change statements. We should be expecting the second annual climate change statement delivered to Parliament before too long, right?
Ooh. It's the end of the year is actually quite exciting. Like you get the World Energy Outlook, you get COP, you get climate change statement, you get the projections coming out on Christmas Eve, as is traditional.
Climate nerd Christmas, there you go. Tennant, what have you got?
So I'm going to mention another paper, one that has been causing a little bit of a stir, published in Nature Communications recently, The Momentum of the Solar Energy Transition by, and I'm sure I'm butchering this, Nice et al., is similar to and building on the perspective of the Rupert Way et al. Learning rates paper we keep banging on about from last year. This is similarly taking insights about the persistence of strong learning rates, lowering the costs with greater deployment of wind and solar and other key technologies. But it's trying to answer the question of what would a more realistic business as usual scenario, more realistic, not completely realistic, because it assumes no more new policy on climate change ever. But if there were no more new policy, what would the momentum of technological change and learning, as better understood now, actually deliver? And their conclusion is that we have likely passed a tipping point where the costs of renewable energy, but particularly of solar, are declining so far, so fast that they will dominate the future energy system regardless of policy, and deliver a much lower emissions pathway than used to be assumed in BAU scenarios. It's absolutely not a finding that says, right, everybody, time to curl up in an armchair with a brandy and a good book and just wait out this inevitable beneficent transition.
That's disappointing.
I mean, it is disappointing. Yes, I was looking forward to a good book. But what they find is still a much higher level of residual emissions than is, and a slower pathway to deep emissions reduction than is consistent with temperature goals for limiting climate change. But the amount of change needed is less than we used to assume. And they also recommend maybe a greater focus on policies that are oriented around facilitating that faster deployment of clean energy and all the barriers in practice to that around finance in low-income economies, in terms of social licence and planning reform and so on, rather than the orientation of policy as it used to be of how do we have a sufficiently high effective carbon price to counteract the fundamental expensiveness of these technologies, which is no longer realistically the case.
What's the complementary policies becoming primary as the price issue is resolved, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting.
That one also does make me wonder whether there's a whole lot of stuff we've learnt through learning rates and deployment rates and so on in clean energy that's going to hop across to other areas and solve other problems that aren't climate problems, whether that's, vaccines or medical equipment or something else, that maybe we've actually going to get really good at learning really fast how to make things better. And that would be nice, wouldn't it?
It would be excellent. If only there was some technology that could address the housing crisis, some means of attaching, as Matthew Iglesias always troll tweets, multiple dwellings maybe stacked on top of each other. It's something we need a lot of research on, I'm sure.
Have you ever stayed in one of those hotels that are modular like that, though? They're weird in the rooms. Like the bathrooms are weird because they're modular, like manufactured off-site bathrooms that are just craned in, and they're just odd.
I look forward to being lifted to my next hotel room by crane.
All right. My one more thing is a shout out to a big new initiative that my organisation, the Energy Efficiency Council, is launching this week with our friends at the Clean Energy Council. Your organisation, Tenant AI Group, is involved, as well as another 50 partner organisations. The Careers for Net Zero campaign is a big national effort to highlight the urgent need to ramp up the capability and capacity of the clean economy workforce. And we talk regularly on this pod about how we have a lot of the technology we need to get this transition done. But one thing we don't have enough of is people, humans, to make it happen. So this campaign is designed to highlight to people with all kinds of skills and backgrounds that they have a home in the clean economy. So what we've done is recruited 10 champions that are already working in the clean economy, and the idea is that they act as inspiration to others to join this growing workforce. We've got champions from right around the country, and they represent the full spectrum of skills we need. We've got an engineer and an electrician. That wouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but we also have an installation installer and a facilities manager, a community engagement advisor, an investment analyst, and we've even got some head-kicking take no prisoners policy director named Frankie Muscovich as one of our champions. Yeah. So Frankie, along with every one of our 10 champions, is going to be the focus of a big social media campaign that is rolling out over the coming months to get people excited about a career in the clean economy. And alongside all of that, our partner organisations are going to be strongly advocating for an effective workforce development strategy for the clean economy and education and training systems that are up to the task. So by the time this episode is up, the campaign will have been launched at a star-studded event headlined by the newly minted Victorian Premier, Jacinta Allen, and tech billionaire Mike Cannon-Brooks in Melbourne. So if you're interested in all of that, you can check out the campaign and all the associated information at the website, which will be live as you're hearing this, careersfornetzero.org.au.
This is going to grow the podcast audience tenfold, surely.
One would hope so. Yes, that's right. This is a make listeners campaign for the podcast.
Yes.
That's how dastardly planned.
All people undergoing clean energy training need to study, let me sum up thought, in intensive person-to-person classes where those unable to rattle off a list of the key insights of this podcast will be sent for re-education.
And every morning they will assemble with their little yellow book and they will they will shout a long, long life to Chairman Luke as they wave it in the air.
Though we joke, I think there might be one or two hate listeners of this podcast who believe that is the plan.
Big shout out to you guys. Well done for being on to us before anyone else was.
Indeed. All right. Well, that is our show for today. We're on the socials. I learnt, I think, from our show notes after we recorded the last episode, Tennant, is that you have found your way onto Blue Sky.
That is true.
And so now I'm the sad host of this podcast that isn't in the cool club of Blue Sky people.
I think you're cool, Luke.
We think you're cool, Luke. Yeah.
And with my status as a Blue Sky subscriber, my opinion counts.
You've got to kind of just go sleazing around X going with Twitter going, has anyone got codes? Anyone got codes for the other place?
Sleazing around X.
For 50 cents for a phone call, mate.
The first code is free.
All right, well, I'll get right onto that. Alison, you know what I'm going to ask.
You're going to ask me to tell people our email address,
That's
which
right.
is mailbag@letmesumup.net.
Perfect.
And people should send us email, and I think people need to start sending us more suggestions for papers.
Yes.
So if you have come across a report or a paper that is both recent and relevant and not too long, because Luke complains if it's, too long, do drop us an email and let us know.
Ruined by Twitter.
Very unfair.
It's turned into a lot of shade against you at this this end of the podcast.
I decided to give you a rest. I didn't want to roast
Okay.
you too much this week, Tennant.
Well, that's good. That's good.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Tennant, what is our website and what is there?
At letmesumup.net, you can find a cavalcade of episodes covering all the colours of the climate and energy policy rainbow. Go to letmesumup.net and download like crazy.
I endorse that message for Alison Reid and Tennant Reid. I'm Luke Mansell. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. We've only got 2 more episodes before COP. Tennant and I, well, theoretically, are in COP. Still theoretic.
I'm still waiting to find out. I'm getting increasingly nervous.
Well, no one's found out, so there's actually no reason to be nervous. If other people were kind of waving around their golden tickets, then that would be...
I would be going through Charlie's Dark Night of the Soul, stumbling through the streets, then looking in a gutter and seeing a shiny 50-cent piece that I could use to run to the chocolate shop and see if my golden ticket to attend the COP is inside.
You wouldn't just convince Erwin or someone to let you sit on his shoulders and just wear a really long overcoat or something.
Yeah.
I think I might have to pledge to let him sit on my shoulders.
Imagine a sort of a long flying robe and a Gandalf kind of affect.